welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Tonight, well, we do part 18 of Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective. And tonight, we're going to finish off covering the second half of Romano Mussolini's book, My Father, Il Duce. In part 17 of the series, I covered the first half of the book, which was very interesting. I covered chapters 1 through 9. Tonight, I'd like to cover chapters 10 through 15. And let's start with chapter 10, actually, assassination season. So when Mussolini was in power, there was 4 assassination attempts made against Il Duce, or Il Duce, excuse me. And a few fascinating things about it is that I remember reading, at least from the Nicholas Farrell book. Now, I know that Ramano doesn't mention it here, that all 4 assassination attempts, Mussolini actually, he did not exercise the death penalty in any case. And it is said that he forgave all of the assailants or the perpetrators that were trying to assassinate him. The first of the assassinations came from military people, inside people within the government that had set up a gun at a balcony near, waiting for him to step out and speak to the people like he normally did. 2 ex-military people. They never got the shot off, and they were arrested. I believe they received 30 years prison sentence. I believe they were reduced. Don't quote me on that, but I believe they were reduced later on. The second attempt on his life was actually done by an Anglo-Saxon woman. I thought she was British. Romano says she was Irish, so I'll go with that. She was Irish. And while Mussolini was sort of gathering around the people, she pulled out a pistol, shot twice at him, and she skirted his nose, right? Later on in pictures, you'll see Mussolini wearing kind of like a bandage, a thing over his nose. That was from that assassination attempt from that woman. And so in that situation there, it was interesting because, again, I think Italian law would have required or could have required a death penalty there. In that case, it was clear that the woman was mentally ill. And Mussolini worked out something with the British government and basically sent her back to Britain as long as the British government kind of agreed to send her to counseling, sort of mental counseling, things of that nature, to get mental help. And the British government agreed to that. The third assassination attempt in his life came when it was a motorcade, and somebody actually threw a grenade at the car that Mussolini was in. The grenade went off. It did not get Mussolini. Few people were injured on it. And you have that one there. And then the fourth attempt in his life was kind of a sad one, where Mussolini was driving again in a caravan. And it is said that a 15-year-old boy shot at Mussolini, hit part of his uniform, actually, and go show you how much he continued to escape death. Now, in regards to the 15-year-old boy, it was the crowd that pointed out that this boy was the assailant in this case, and the kid was actually beat to death by the crowd. Mussolini never saw the 15-year-old boy as his convoy continued to go forward. But Romano says he never forgot the 15-year-old boy. And when it came down to sort of the investigation, Mussolini, it sounds like to me, thwarted the investigation by saying, no, it wasn't the boy with the dark coat and the hat on. It was from the other side, light coat, no hat on. And so I'm trying to figure out in the book if Romano is saying that because he felt sorry for the boy that was murdered effectively by the mob that beat him, stabbed him, all that stuff in response to the shooting. I'm not sure if Mussolini just, it was a situation where, okay, maybe the boy did it and Mussolini still felt bad for him because he's a 50-year-old boy, or he's trying to deflect. I'm not sure exactly what Romano is saying, but something about how Mussolini in his life never forgot this particular assassination precisely because a 15-year-old boy died on this occasion during his caravan. And so, which was a sad ending, to say the least. But there is another one here that Romano does not mention. I always thought there was 4 assassination attempts, but there was another one in Nicholas Farrow book that he describes where there was a man that was applying for a job to work, I guess, in the offices of the government when he was a plant, and he was given a pistol to be interviewed by Mussolini. And the plan was to walk into the offices to meet with Mussolini, pull out the gun, and shoot him. But apparently, as this potential assassin walked into the office, he lost his nerve. And he looked at Mussolini, pulled out the pistol, set it on his desk, and basically admitted to what he planned to do, but that he lost his nerve. Mussolini slowly grabbed the gun, took it away from him, called the authorities. Later on, Mussolini let him go as well, too. I don't believe he was charged with anything, if I remember correctly. So trying to get my story straight, between 4 and 5 assassination attempts. That one about the assailant coming into his office with a pistol was not mentioned by Romano, was mentioned in another one. So I'm assuming it's 5 assassination attempts. And Romano goes on to talk about how the topic of assassination was very common in their household, right? Because there wasn't much security that Mussolini actually walked around with, and neither did his family. And so assassination attempts were a common theme, a common talk in the household. You know, Rachelle, being the mother, always worried about this, that, you know, one day, you know, something like this could happen. And, it just, it was just part of the Mussolini life, trying to understand, again, dealing with governance and dealing with issues of security. So assassinations were a big part of it. I know there was another story, who was it? The Rosselli brothers, right? Also tried to assassinate Mussolini at one time. It's another story that I remember reading. I'm not sure how far they got. They were, in those days, it was so strange with the different socialist brands that you had. These 2 brothers were Italians, and they consider themselves, what is it, socialist libertarians, which I have no idea what that means, what a socialist libertarian is. They went to Spain to fight on the side of the communists over there, and when they fled Italy, they fled into France, who were more than happy to give them refuge there, of course, because France and Italy were always at odds with one another. France having a really radical government as well, too. Those 2 brothers actually found by the fascists in Italy and beat up, and they died at the hands as sort of those fascist reprisals that would go on oftentimes in those days in regards to, the war in the streets between fascists and communists. And so that's another interesting story. I'll see if I get more details on that at some point. And so, again, this is an interesting topic, again, as usual, because it hits home, right, with the family itself. And it's something you could tell that, Romano, as he's talking about this, it's real to them as a family and something that they had to deal with. Let's see here. Let's go now to chapter. Let's see here, guys. Chapter 11, my mother's rivals. Okay, my mother's rivals. Well, this again goes to, Mussolini being what do you want to call it, a lover of the ladies, or the ladies loving him. Obviously here Romano acknowledges what it's like for a man in power and for Mussolini to be the most desired man in Italy. And so he had his fair share of affairs. Obviously, Claretta Petacci is the big one. We talked about that in the first part of this, back in part 17. of this book, and I don't need to give you too much of a rundown there, other than I think Patachi probably caused Rachelle the most pain. She admitted that to Romano. Another one of his affairs, if you want to call it there, was Ida Dalser. Ida Dalser. Now, this is a long story, and this is one that has never really been put together completely. But Ida Dalser claimed to be Mussolini's first wife, or his real wife. Now, this all happened obviously before he met Rachelle, is before he went off to war in World War One, when Mussolini was probably in the heydays of his affairs as a young man, chasing the ladies, things of that nature. Um, Mussolini fathered a child with Ida Dassler, who was named Little Benito. Okay, so there was an illegitimate child of sorts, but Mussolini broke it off with her for some reason. But Dassler never let go of Mussolini, as he kept showing up as a problem, a nuisance of sorts in Mussolini's life after he got married to Rachelle. And of course, there's a confrontation once again with Rachelle. It was after Mussolini was in the hospital. I believe is when he got back from World War One. He was in the hospital, and Ida Dassler showed up claiming to be Mussolini's wife, and Rachelle was there, and they was a well, they were throwing punches at each other for what it sounds like, and Mussolini, being in a hospital bed, had to get up. Security had to step in. They say the guards were getting a good laugh out of it, and as these two women started to fight over Benito, obviously. The sad part about the Dassler story is that eventually she would be committed to a psychiatric institute along with, little Benito. Eventually, they would both die, I believe, in institutions. I know Ida Dassler did in 1937. Benito would die in 42, which leads to a lot of the conspiracies that Mussolini, out of great shame, had both of them put to death. Of course, there's no evidence for that. Um, that's a rumor, according to Nicholas Farrell, that came up after the war, after Mussolini was already dead. Most likely a communist plot to, to destroy his character and things of that nature, like they did. Kind of like the stories of they made up with Clara Petacci on the day that they were shot, how Clara Petacci could not find her panties, right? That was part of a story that was made up by communist partisans. We know that from another book on the other book, what's it called? Mussolini and Churchill book that I have about the conspiratorial papers between the two. And so this is one of those things in Mussolini's legacy that's never really fully developed. It's never fully answered, because from what I've read, there's not a whole lot of details on it, other than this lady existed. She had a child with Mussolini. Mussolini, married Rachelle later on, had moved on, but the other woman previous in her life did not move on. Mussolini did pay child support to her, 200 lira for a certain period of time, and it winds up being this kind of vague story. Is it a dark story in Mussolini's life on a personal level? Yeah, I think you could say that. I think it's probably a point of critique, though we don't know. I don't buy the story or the propaganda. I would say, well, the story. I don't want to say probably. It could be true, but I'm not buying the notion that Mussolini had both of them killed. It doesn't make sense, simply because it was not in his nature, especially with his own offspring. Right? He was a family man later on. He proved that, and so I'm just not sure, and there's not enough evidence, and I couldn't even begin to speculate into that, because it would be slander if you go one way, and then, if you go the other way, they call you delusional and a revisionist. But I don't know, unless there's more evidence that I haven't seen on the matter. all we can do is say that it was just a disordered time in his life. He had a disordered relationship. You could understand it. You gotta remember, Mussolini, like a lot of communists, was radically atheist at one time, and with that matter comes lots of social disorders, including sexual disorders, which communists are known for. And he probably had a bunch of entanglements. In fact, I know he had a few entanglements with the young ladies when he was a young Marxist. That's just a matter of fact. And this came back to haunt him later on. How he ended it all, at the end of the day, that's what's left open to interpretation. And I'll leave it at that. Probably a dark, disordered past in history that he had to live with, again, as a man that was chasing women early in his youth. And there's been plenty of men throughout history that have found themselves in those kinds of predicaments. Chapter 12, Bruno's death shatters my father. Well, this is about Bruno Mussolini, the eldest son of Benito Mussolini. Bruno was a guy that liked adventure, and a very experimental guy with the airplanes. He joined the Air Force, did lots of airplane testing, things of that nature. He traveled around the world, and he found himself in a situation where one day he was testing a particular airplane. I think it was the S-79, taking off from, I believe it was Pisa, Italy, and the plane just couldn't get off the air, and it clipped a cottage and crashed the plane. And Bruno, who wasn't wearing a helmet, died. Those that were wearing a helmet in the accident, they survived. I think there was 5 survivor and 3 deaths. According to Romano testimony, said the survivor said that Bruno fought vigilantly to correct the flight situation that had gone bad. He didn't panic, he stayed calm, but he couldn't save the plane, and in the process lost his life. For Benito and Rachelle, of course, this was devastating, and so much so that Benito wrote a book about his deceased son and about the sufferings of a father that loses a son. This is why I don't buy the story that Benito had the other illegitimate son killed at the end of the day. Listen, it's just a speculative play on my part, that I'm suggesting. It just, Italian men, and I'm not suggesting there's a greater attachment, but I know Italian men and their attachments to their sons and to their children in general. It's just a situation where he lost Bruno. He was devastated by it. They say he never recovered. What haunted Rachelle the most was the fact that Benito became very silent. After the death of Bruno, he wouldn't really talk about it. He was in that much despair. Losing your oldest son to a tragedy like that affected him. And later on, and like I mentioned, another cast, when he's finally deposed as the head of the Italian state, he's being held prisoner in 1943 at the island of Ponzo. He asked the priest there at the island to say a mass for his deceased son, Bruno, which you could tell Mussolini was kind of moving more to faith. There was also a quote there about his son saying something like, if Bruno were to see how the war was going, his soul must be tormented, which I kind of don't know what it means, but it's clearly Mussolini, Benito at least, thinking his son is probably in purgatory. And I think obviously offering a mass for his son is a clear giveaway for that. So, and it was a very tough period in his life. Loses his oldest son. Chapter 13, we were not welcome in Switzerland. So these are the last days of the war, effectively, the last days of the Republic of Salo, which was, I think it was a puppet regime set up by Hitler, in my opinion, from what I've read. I think some people will say, especially Mussolini's mind, that it wasn't a puppet regime. It was a real country, but we can beg to differ on that. I think it was a puppet government. And so this one is it's kind of a hard read, and well, not a hard read, it's a touching read, because it's really not only the last days of the war, the last days of the Solid Republic, it's the last days of the Mussolini family as they were, right? A close-knit family together. Benito is assassinated on April 28th, 1945. The last time he saw his family was, I believe, April 17th, 11 days earlier than that. The war was going bad at that point, and he had a scheduled meeting in Milan that he was going to travel to. And he stepped out of the house with his briefcase, had some papers on him. It was that nature. He kind of stopped, looked back, looked at the house, kind of a somber moment, looked at his wife, and basically said, listen, I'll be back, kind of a thing. And of course, he would never make it back. Reports were that the Allies had broken through the defenses and blocked off a lot of the roads, and all of a sudden now everybody is on the run. You have the fascists, you have the partisans, aka the communists, that are hunting down all the fascists, lining them up and shooting them on the side of a road. There was no trial, there was none of that going on. It is said that the Americans wanted Mussolini alive. They were trying to get him alive. Mussolini never would have gone, from my understanding. That's why he was heading to the Swiss border. But for that matter, it wasn't just Mussolini in a caravan heading to the Swiss border. It was also Rachelle and his children heading to the Swiss border. You had Rachelle, you had, of course, Romano, Vittorio, and Anna Maria. Now, I don't think Victoria was with them. I think it was just Rachelle, Anna Maria, and Romano. They were heading to the border. Victorio, in the chaos, had gotten lost in the shuffle as well too, and they hadn't heard from him in a few days. I'm not sure if he was military or not, but he had gotten lost in the shuffle. But when they got to the Swiss border, they just would not let the Mussolinis through, Rachelle and the two kids. Apparently there was some kind of orders not to let them through. And from there, they had to find some lodging accommodations. And, Mussolini's, Italy and fascist Italy at the time, they had some allies, and they found a home where they could stay at. Somebody took them in effectively, and they stayed there. And he talked about, he remembers, Romano did, the gunshots and the firing as the war is approaching closer and closer, and kind of what to do next. And, they just kind of stood pat where they were in his home. And of course, eventually they would get the news that Benito, his father, well, was assassinated. One of the, I guess, servants of the house where they were staying at walks into the room carrying a newspaper. I think it was the Unita Italian newspaper, and presented it to the family. The servant was crying, and there it was, that Benito was on the front page. He had been hung up in Piazza. What is it? Piazza. I forgot the name of the piazza. It's in Milan now. And they're kind of the reality that Rachelle's husband and Romano, the son, it hit them that their father was gone. It was kind of one of those surreal moments for them. And then, of course, after that, the aftermath of the war, again, the fascists are being hunted down, and eventually Rachelle, along with the kids, are arrested. They're sent to an internment camp for a couple of years until things are worked out. Eventually, they were released and they were free again. But of course, there was always worry about what was going to happen if they were ever going to be set free, if they weren't just going to be lined up and shot. That was part of the issue. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know if they had friends or allies who they could trust at that point. And very curious, and another interesting thing, as you know, as the lead up to themselves being arrested, Romano said that they were trying to burn as many documents as they could, particularly to hide their identity if they could, right? The mother and the two kids. And one of the things that Romano says in the book that he regrets is a government document that suggested that the king of the House of Savoy was in favor of the war the entire time, at least leading up to the war. And so, because remember, the entire blame is put on the Mussolini regime, and the king tries to find an excuse, you know, to alleviate himself after the war. And I can kind of see that in a way. But according to this document, and Romano burnt it personally, he said, no, the king was in on the war. He was in favor of the war the entire time. But because the document was burnt, the entire blame eventually fell on Benito Mussolini for the war, of course, right? Now, that didn't help the monarchy later on, as the monarchy was ousted in 46, and then eventually in 48 with the first liberal democratic government, of course, right? But I guess it may have got the monarchy off the hook for responsibility for the war. So that's interesting of itself. And so it was just a mad dash and scramble to survive. You know, we all know the story of Benito. Obviously, he was in a caravan heading to the Swiss border. It was stopped by uh, a patrol group of partisans, and they tried to hide Benito's identity by putting a German uniform on him along with a helmet, but he was discovered. And of course, he was taken to some town hall or something like that, held there for like, I don't know, it's like 48 hours, I believe, something to that nature. Eventually moved to a home, a cottage home, something like that, and held prisoner. And then that morning, him and Clara Petacci were picked up, put in cars, and somewhere near, I believe, Lake Como, they were asked to um, get out of the car, and that's when they were shot and killed on the side of the road. Um, and that's the story there. So, you know, again, the somber end of a war, whether you believe that the Mussolinis were good guys or bad guys, it's a tough read because they're human beings with real feelings. I still find it, despite all the mistakes that Mussolini made, particularly by getting into that war, he never should have been in it, right? Despite that, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to read sort of the human element of it, the suffering, especially of a family. Now, of course, many families struggle, right? My family was there at the time, and they had their struggles. I had relatives that were lost in the war, so the war was a total disaster, and Mussolini has to be blamed for that disaster without a doubt. But I'm not convinced that he is the criminal that history has made him out to be. I believe um, that's liberal propaganda post-war, and so to me, it's very difficult to again read this at the end of his life, the destruction of family and a human life, and say, wow, it's a tough read, right? Because they really cared for each other. So that was that chapter there, chapter 13. Chapter 14, My Mother's Dream. So this was interesting too. I guess Rachelle, after Benito's death, you know, in her agony over losing her husband, had a dream, and Benito came to her in a dream. And the dream is fascinating. It's fascinating. And there's, now you say, well, Frank, it's a dream. What could that mean? Well, it's interesting because there's some points of legitimacy here when you think of the dream. Benito came to her in a dream. He was kind of glowing, and he was in his uniform, I believe is what it was. And she asked him in the dream about, you know, how he was doing. And his response, I forgot what it was now. Something like, I'm doing fine. Don't worry about me. And she asked him about how he died. And did it hurt? And Benito's response in the dream was, it didn't hurt. I was shot in the back 9 times, and it didn't hurt. It felt like heat, like something warm, and then it was over. And this kind of, this kind of a dream really threw her off. And she woke up in one of those moments. For her, it was like surreal kind of a moment, and um, she ran to her son's room to get comfort of Romano, and Romano tells a story. Now, what is fascinating about it here is there's a couple of aspects of this dream. Now, I kind of just shot through the details of the dream because I'm trying to remember from memory. In the book, he lays it out much more with much more detail, which is very important. That gives some insight, things of that nature. Now, to deviate from the book for a moment, okay, to deviate from that for a moment, it was said that after Rachelle Mussolini had a dream about Benito visiting her, it was at that point that Rachelle Mussolini went to go visit Padre Pio, the Catholic mystic, down in San Giovanni Rotondo. And it was there that it was said that Padre Pio confirmed to Rachelle Mussolini that Benito had gotten into purgatory, right? It was one of the confirmations. What that means with this mystic stuff, I'm just reporting to you what the story says. It's interesting to me. But the other interesting part of this is that they did an autopsy, several autopsies on the body of Mussolini. And it was confirmed that he had 9 bullet holes in him. Because in the dream, I now remember, Mussolini had told Rachelle that he was shot by submachine guns, and he had 9 bullet holes, and the autopsy confirmed what the dream had said. Now, for us, it's like, okay, well, that's, just, coincidence, dumb luck, whatever it is. But for Rachelle and even the people at the time, that wasn't a coincidence. It meant something at that time, in that moment. And from there, then became a real, what do you want to call it? A real moment of trial and tribulation, because the Allies had taken Mussolini's body. Rachelle wanted a Christian burial for Benito, but the Allies had a different plan at the time. One of the things they did was they interrogated the corpse for, I guess, a criminal investigation or criminal, what do you want to call it, autopsy, to see the nature of what apparently a supposed brutal dictator, what it governs and how it governs. And part of his brain was clipped off, I guess you could say. Part of it sent to an institute in Milan, and then the other one, it was sent to America so they could do experiments to see what the brain of a mass murdering dictator, that's how Mussolini was viewed after the war, what it looked like, and what was it about the brain that led Mussolini to make the decisions that he made. Obviously, a clear bias on the part of liberal societies, right, that places judgment values on a difference between a fascistic form of government and a liberal republic. I find it interesting because, again, would we ever do that for I don't know, a leader in a Western liberal republic, in a democracy? There's been some very shameful things that liberal republics have done, that presidents even of America have done. Never would they ever be treated with such disrespect, that to have their brains taken out of their body. And so after 12 years of trying to get her body, not her body, but her husband's body back, she finally got it back. And the fascinating part about it all here again is that there was a period of time after the Italian government returned Benito's body, before it returned Benito's body, that actually the body was being held at a monastery where the monks were watching over after the body of Mussolini for a great period of time, for like, I believe, almost a decade. And so the body was actually laid in a crypt, in a coffin right next to an altar. Interesting enough, it goes to show you the admiration that Mussolini earned with the church. Remember, we've talked about things like the Lateran Accords, and while there was and the church and the state, the fascist government butted heads, there was a great respect for Mussolini by the clergy. Mussolini was never anti-clerical, unlike the monarch, which was anti-clerical. Mussolini worked with the church and earned a great respect from the clergy in Italy, and with that, they reciprocated a sort of a respect to where they protected the body. They actually moved the body around quite a bit secretly, because there was always rumors that, you know, certain groups wanted to steal the body to desecrate it even further, and that's was part of the protection plan by the monks that protected Mussolini. And so you know, so the body was finally returned to Rachelle 12 years after his death in 1957. Oh, one of the hard things was one of the doctors, there was two doctors that did autopsies on his body, but one of the professors, his name was Casaniga, Professor Casaniga. He looked very disturbed at the moment where the coffin was presented to Rachelle, and he was nervous because in his hand he held a glass jar that actually had the brain of Benito Mussolini in the glass jar, and he nervously gave it to his wife. Now imagine that for a moment, guys, right? Um, that his whole brain had to be taken out of his body in total desecration in a moment of death. Um, and and then there was a burial at San Cassiano cemetery, and that's in his hometown, I believe, of Prevedapio there, and that's where the body has rested since 1957. But it was, you know, it was very difficult dealing with that, with the aftermath and trying to figure out what was going to happen, because again, she insisted on a Christian burial, and it took 12 years before Mussolini finally got his Christian burial. That was one of the great disgraces, from at least her perspective, of how the governments treated her husband, you know, even after the war. And they went through hell in a handbasket to get the body back. And finally, chapter 15 is titled "A Few Words About Me," and this is basically Romano talking about himself, and you know, kind of wrapping it up. And I gotta admit, he doesn't talk much about himself. I mean, he wrote a book about his father, and he pretty much stuck to it. He took, I think, 3 or 4 pages to talk about himself. And Romano was, you know, he has all these memories and experiences of his father. Obviously, he loved his father, didn't see his father as a criminal like, you know, we in the West have defined him to be in many ways. Um, you know, and after the war, he was along with his mother, rest of his family, finally got freedom, I think, in 1949. And from there, he kind of ventured around and he was farming for a while during the 1950s, and then he was a musician, and he started playing jazz and going all around Italy and around the world playing jazz music. He was a musician, he was a painter, he kind of floundered around, said he made lots of mistakes, had 2 marriages, had a few kids. One of the kids, Alessandra, one of her daughters, became a politician in Italy. I think she may still be a politician over there. I'm not sure. I've seen her on YouTube a few times, but of course, the Mussolini name running in Italian politics is always controversial. But I think they've had a couple of Mussolinis now that entered parliamentary governments over there to be an influence, or to do whatever it is they believe in over there now. And with that, Romano just kind of lived out his life as a dad, as a musician, traveled all over the world, met lots of people. Now, he did mention that, you know, when his name started going up on posters, like for advertisement for concerts and things of that nature, he said he could never outrun his name. And the moment he starts to gain some popularity because of his music, of course, the legacy of his father follows, and he had a sort of a fame of sorts. And and crowds would gather around him out of curiosity, sort of popularity, and ask for autographs and pictures or whatever it is that they were doing at the time. And it's something he had to live with the rest of his life. And then he wrote this book, I believe in 2005, published 2006, but I believe he also died in 2006, and he kind of just wraps up his life very simple. The book is a short read. It's an easy read. There are a few things that he fills in the gaps. I think it's more of a confirmation. A lot of what's in here was already in Rachelle's book, her biography about Benito Mussolini. But there are a few nuggets in here from his perspective, how he sees it, that are very good, that I really liked. I thought it was a well-written book. I think in the end, I'll go back to the beginning of the last episode, part 17, where I talk about the first half of the book. I'm more convinced now than ever that the introduction hit piece that I talked about in when I talked about the first half of this book in part 17 was a complete hit piece now. There's no need to revise anything that was really in the book from my perspective and what I saw. I think clearly there was a fraternal or a familial love here for Benito, but this is not Romano trying to revise history in any kind of way. It's pretty consistent with all the books I've read on Benito. Now the far, I guess, what do you want, a communistic side, the far liberal side will say this is revisionist history, because all of a sudden now there's been a movement the past 20 years or so that has tried to, I guess, give a little bit more credibility to Mussolini in certain ways, and certain leftist partisans don't want that, right? He's been caricatured in history as this great villain who was Hitler's allies. Millions of people died because of these two leaders, of course, along with Japan. And that's the narrative that we built. But the problem, of course, is we're in the age of the internet now, right? We're not localized communities where, right, we can give out a general narrative where we're limited on our resources. Like when I was a kid going to the local library and I got to read all the history books that the local library allowed me to read, that basically their inventory was a selection of sorts, right? Those days are gone. And that's how you could create narratives after a war, when you can control information. And we know that everything has been hijacked since the end of World War II from a political perspective, as leftists and communists and partisans, all these institutions have been hijacked, including libraries, to be just one small example. And so when we get into the age of the internet, there's more information being passed around and we have different sources. We could create a new picture, a better picture, a more accurate picture of these historical figures. I think Mussolini is one of those. I think one of the things that's very clear, and the next book that I'm going to be reading is, again, Richard Lamb's book, Benito Mussolini as a Diplomat, is the fact that Benito tried desperately to keep Italy out of the war. Ultimately, he didn't succeed, and it was his downfall along with Italy's downfall. But he wasn't this dark, sort of cartoonish caricature that was made up after the war, right? That there was a much more diplomatic side of Mussolini, a much more reasonable side of Mussolini. And if that narrative ever got out, well, that was going to present problems to the liberal narrative. That's why the hit piece, the introduction by this Alexander Still or Style, whatever his name is here, was such a bad choice by the publishers of this book. An actual disgrace. This book, in no kind of way do I find this as a threat. It's simply a son remembering his father. You don't have to agree with all of his politics, but it is his point of view. It is a firsthand account, right? And that's what's important here, that it's a primary source. And we could compare it to, other historical documents and stories and historical evidence and say, okay, where does this fall in line with the complete history when we look at these particular characters? And I think Ramano just gives it from his own perspective. The book it's well written, it's simple. I don't think he's trying to shatter any real big conspiracy theories here. He's just laying it out. I think he does a great job, and I think he comes off as very credible, at least from my perspective. So there you have it. My Father, Il Duce by Romano Mussolini. It was a great read, and there's lots of more little details in here that I'll probably be pulling out to tell you more stories and give you a more complete perspective as I continue down the line with this particular series. So once again, this is part 18 of Mussolini, an Italian-American experience. This is Frank. I want to thank you for joining me. Signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.